did not send it, we're sending it. It talks about things like practice. So give yourself the exam and the exam time, and try to see how you can be much more explicitly conscious of the short amount of time you'll have, and so you need to use your time efficiently and get used to that, and just practicing writing. And like, you do that for every course, and the more you do that, the more you actually. Thank you. Do the exam itself. The simple points we've repeated. That we've got both essays and identification questions, some choice. So if we have 5 or 6, 4 or 5 or 6 concepts, maybe identify 3 of them, 3 or 4 of them, and write about them. There's one point, actually, I didn't change that in the written statement. It's a written statement which says you may not or you should not exceed so many lines or words. I would revise that. I don't think I asked him to take that out. Maybe I didn't, but I'd say the more you write, the better. In general, don't feel you must have only X words in either the IB or the exam. The more you write, the better. Generally, so if you have, try to bring many concepts to bear, but most of all, show your organization. You're thinking about this. You're thinking about how all the pieces fit together. You've got the individual readings, and then show to
recording
okay. Let's see. Anything else that anyone wants to raise as a question, such as what did Dahl say about issue areas? Or why is that important? Can you all answer that now? What's your name? Yeah. Nate. Okay. Any thoughts on Dahl and issue areas, just to get it started?
I'm trying to remember, was that like the new political culture stuff, or am I mixing these up?
No, Robert Dahl's book is called Who Governs? And we take over one big point from Dahl in the new political culture book, which is his concept of issue areas, which I'm asking about now because it's a critical point.
Oh, is that the focus on like certain sectors of policy rather than saying like left or right?
Exactly. That's the big idea. Or not even saying left and right. That is the persons, especially Floyd Hunter, just before Dahl, and there were 160 papers and books about this kind of stuff in those years, all basically discussed is there business, or that is, they wouldn't ask generally is, they would say, here are the elite leaders of Atlanta or of Ann Arbor or whatever. And then they would identify them by name, and they would say, these are, and then these are 78% are business leaders. And so business leaders are the people who get mentioned when you ask Hunter's question, which was, anybody? How did it differ from Dahl? Hunter's question was, who's important here in Atlanta, or here in another town, Waco? That is, the question did not specify issue areas. So Dahl, by contrast, said, ask the questions about a particular issue. such as the school board decisions or the mayoral elections or urban economic development, and you'll get differentiated answers from the same people who will answer the question, the business leaders may be important. Okay, so I mean, that's a little bit crude, but then Dahl pushed further in using what was called the decisional approach. And that was the idea that he reconstructed specific decisions. He didn't just say who's important, he said, who initiates, who supports, who mediates, who conflicts, and who prevails. Those kinds of questions get a sense of, and in the case of the three issues, these are the three issue areas. These are the core of his book, Who Governs? How and why might this really show that we have concentric circles? Another way to tell the same story. If we have school board, mayoral election, and economic development, in the case of New Haven, as he showed, basically only the mayor and a handful of people were, usually his staff, were involved in all of these issue areas. Rather, most participants, even so-called elites, were only issue specific. They didn't generalize to other issue areas. And so Philip Converse then was a social psychologist, sociologist in Michigan. He changed really, his work transformed the focus of a lot of work on public opinion and citizens, because he studied the same kind of thing with citizens and showed that most citizens don't know and don't care about most issues. In a sense, Dahl is showing something about elites. Nevertheless, many citizens still have strong interest in something, whether it's beer or football or fraternity parties or something else. Solving a mathematical puzzle they've been working on for their entire lives. Than beer and pretzels. So you may be very knowledgeable about that one issue, but you may not be knowledgeable about many other issues, which may be what's left or right, or how can you interpret these tweets from Donald Trump? Don't care. I care about my mathematical issue. Okay, so if citizens tend to have that kind of issue specificity, then citizens won't get involved or go to meetings in issues that are far from them. And so this has been increasingly recognized following, as I mentioned, Converse. And so that then has led to a reconceptualization of how you look at participation, who's really participating. Do we have democracy in India or China? Which is more democratic and why? Those kinds of questions then tend to get raised. And the big point that makes is that democracy is not simply voting. Democracy includes all different kinds of things. So I put up a slide taken from the last chapter of Kentucky Karaoke. And we list there lots of additional dimensions not usually included in citizen participation. And the local area is the best way to study this, because you can see things go up and down. Participation levels and rates and patterns go up and down based on more subtleties than most of the ideological journalistic accounts suggest. For example, does participation go up if you're in a place which is more if you live in a neighborhood or you live in a municipality like Palo Alto, where people are more homogeneous relatively, compared to Chicago. Some people suggest participation should increase in places where people are more homogeneous, because you won't have conflict and you ought to be able to come out. And so Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, says if we have greater diversity, that will suppress participation because you won't want to argue with your neighbors. And blacks, and if you have more blacks and whites, in this measure included so-called non-whites and using the census data, the larger proportion of non-whites in an area, the lower the participation. That was one of his main findings. Okay. So he pursued that, and I would say conversely, if you look more closely at a bigger set of data and more different kinds of participation, you may find the opposite. That is, if you have everybody around you in, say, Hyde Park talks and thinks the same way, everybody's moderately left, and a few people wildly, etc. With exceptions. I'm giving you a stereotype, so you can react against it and say, okay, how can you measure diversity? How can you measure? And so the point here is, if you have a lot, that is, why participate at all? If everybody agrees, nobody disagrees, there's nothing to talk about. So take the ideal, typical, extreme hypothetical example. If everyone had identical preferences about local public policy, if you just took a random sample of one citizen, you'd get the same answer as you would if you took 2,000 other citizens. They all say the same thing. They don't need to turn out to show that what their preferences are. The city council and the mayor don't need to have active banners of people marching or protest demonstrations, because everybody agrees in Palo Alto we want nicely cut grass. We want to have a nice stuff. I've been at meetings with mayors, including the mayor of Palo Alto, for instance, talking to the mayors of other places. It's interesting. So I'm including some individual cases this way to try not to say one of these is right or wrong, but to encourage you to think about where and why might a proposition that education increases participation. It's most of the literature on citizen participation simplifies to the social background characteristics of individuals. Blacks participate less. Women feel beaten down, so they should participate more. Immigrants should participate less because they don't know the local culture. I mean, those are the kinds of things you see in the press these days about diversity. Therefore, we need to have more explicit engagement in different ways of using something like affirmative action, for instance. And so that kind of analysis, often, especially in the press or in rhetorical debates, say, we're discriminated against, we're not represented properly. And so the question is, compared to what? Compared to this, compared to Congress. That is, nobody's represented all that much. But where and how, what does representation mean? That's what we'll talk about this more after the exam. I don't want to want too much, but I'm elaborating the idea of issue specificity, homogeneity, which is stressed in the any reading you can remember. Where is homogeneity as it relates to participation? And I mentioned it class. Beginning of the city money book, first chapter, and that is what it does there is not to say individual characteristics like education or all you need to know, but it brings in contextual characteristics and shifting the ways that the individual characteristics operate. Okay. Pause. Questions from anybody else? Although I can elaborate on anything that you read about that we went over too fast, or I'll look for some things that maybe we did not talk about in class, but which are in the readings, if you don't have anything. That was first reading of the first, so that is what you've got. Just to remind you is the first sections of the course, which are what we're covering now. A, B, C, D, and E. E is not an explicit section, but it's the. I'm sorry. E. It's really F. So really it's 6. So you've got 2 parts, both consumption generally and then the arts, which we talked about last time. Before that, we have leadership, market, political culture, urban innovation, and consumption, then the arts. Okay. These later ones are especially newer, challenging, and criticizing implicitly and explicitly the earlier kinds of conceptualization. So instead of saying business leaders dominate all, or Dahl in turn saying political leaders are important, later on people said, let's look at the context of where and why this made barren, because they did this more explicitly comparative. So they looked at different cities and they noticed, Palo Alto is hugely different from Ann Arbor, is different from Waco. And why? So the could we please close the door? Yeah, okay, great. That is, all of these have some degree of validity. They explain something. And a related point I've been made was that in the late 19th century, we had people like Peirce and others with pragmatists introducing probability, introducing multi-causality, Max Weber, class, status, and party. Everything is not just class, it's also status, it's also parties, or parties can also be driven by status as well as class. And these conceptions, which ranged all the way from theology to philosophy to physics with Einstein and theory of relativity in physics, these emerged in the late 19th century as there was a sense of, oh my God, things are changing in ways that what's right. And this led in turn into the First World War, but that there's a huge sense of transformation away from what people, especially in France, Germany, Austria, Central Europe, saw as right or wrong, and then the battles just led to transformation. That is basically the end of the domination of European civilization. Okay, the introduction of the big concepts like cultural relativism, and much of the 20th and especially 21st century makes these more explicit, as we have citizens not just talking, or that is, you can participate actively in this class if you're not sitting in the room. You can participate by writing memos, you can participate by talking to other people, you can participate by thinking most of all in your own head, how is this really helpful? And then showing it to others in some way. And what ways are things that we lay out 5 different kinds of things. That is, you may read a novel and say, hey, William Faulkner taught me some things about how the South works that I didn't realize, even though I grew up in the South. And gee, I never thought of what Faulkner was writing about here, etc. So I've used Faulkner and some of the New England writers, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, writing about Salem, Massachusetts, to directly contrast the political cultures within their own regions. Example, Salem was the most classically studied puritanical, closed, punishing deviance kind of city, maybe in the US, at least the most visible. Certainly there are elements of this in many other parts of the world, but based on religion and moralism. And so the Scarlet Letter novel he wrote punished a woman who had an affair. And she was placed in public socks, her hands were locked there so everybody could see her being punished. She had to wear an A on her arm for the rest of her life. The adulteress was identified by everyone whenever she walked around anywhere. Okay, so it was a novel, and it was playing up the extreme puritanical negativism, which the author hated himself, even though he was from Salem. Okay, so within Faulkner in the South, some of his leading characters give away their slaves, refuse to fight in the Civil War, hide out, so they're not supporting racial segregation in ways that people in the North have typically said. Everybody in the South was racist. Not true. So I'm using novelists to deviate from the general pattern of their own regions to show better that is what Durkheim talked about was understand the basic values by looking at deviance and how are deviants punished. So in the case of the Salem stocks, she was visibly punished for the rest of her life, showing the strong degree of moralism in that sense, which was active in the city. Try that okay. Contrast, for instance, with the so-called counterculture after 1968, where the style was the opposite in terms of sexual promiscuousness and all kinds of things. Okay. So I'm going back and forth across the sections of the course to have them in part dialoguing with each other, which is a good way to be able to think about and to be able to write about on an exam, but also to ask yourself, why and how is leadership such as the mayor, that is, how much does the mayor really explain? He may be the most active, but how much does he do actively? And so we have a concept that I talked about a couple of times called invisible and dynamic leadership. Anybody want to mention what that refers to? What's invisible leadership and what's dynamic leadership? Yes.
Isn't invisible leadership there was selection wills of like
Just a little slower, a little clearer. Is it?
If I remember correctly, isn't invisible leadership responding largely to the wills of just
Responding to what?
the wills of individuals in the community, or is dynamic
Individual citizens, you mean, or leaders?
individual citizens? Whereas dynamic leadership is leadership where the mayor is a factor alongside various interest groups.
Well, if the mayor is dynamic, he is making a difference as mayor. So he's doing something perhaps himself. So if you talk about Daley did this, or Laurie Lightfoot, mayor, did that, I blame Laurie Lightfoot for Chicago's racial inequality. Okay, if racial inequality goes back for 200 years or 75 years, depending on the neighborhood, et cetera, is it reasonable to blame the current mayor? No. Okay. So the point is, lots of decisions are made by, quote, history or by, okay, question.
I've heard, could you explain?
Slow, clear, slower, and louder.
Could we go over invisible versus dynamic leadership again, just now?
Yes, no, I'm doing so. No,
Oh, okay.
yes, so I'm this came out most clearly in our book City Money, but the analog is especially with the second part of this set of readings called Markets, National and Global. And Paul Peterson's book, City Limits, and Saskia Stockton in their 3-star readings illustrate this problem. That is, they're drawing on mainly market models from, they don't, in their books, they cite from Anthony Downs and other neoclassical economic theory, theorizing kinds of folks who use these simple market models to interpret politics. And Downs does this very explicitly. At the beginning of many of his chapters, he will say the normal, if we use the normal market economic assumptions of full information, open access, for freedom of entry into the market, competition, then we will tend to get a situation where the median voter preference will prevail. So if we have a distribution of voters' preferences like this, where will the policy fall? The median voter, exactly. And that's called the median voter theorem, because that's an explanation of the pure case where the leader is not dynamic. The leader is invisible. Markets are working in the sense of what the economists both normatively and positively define as an efficient market, when the shopkeeper doesn't make any difference. The shopkeeper buys and brings in and buys wholesale and then sells retail to whatever citizens, consumers want in his area. Red shoes, this kind of dress, and so forth. We brought in the counterexample to say, even in the market area, in the discussion of Wicker Park by Richard Lloyd, where we pointed out that bohemianism was continued explicitly by the association of retail shopkeepers when they said, we want to keep bohemianism as a visible cultural style of Wicker Park. That's what makes us different. And even if they're people who are stockbrokers or lawyers or whatever, they want to be here because they don't want to be like those people in Lincoln Park or some more square. Thus, even among shopkeepers, we don't always have shopkeepers who are seeking to be invisible. And in smaller areas, and this is here we get to say that we can take the economic concept of niche markets or niche marketing applied to the political system. What might be a version of niche marketing that we've already discussed today? Yes, that's one good example. How about what's a more general label for bohemian in contrast to another style? Issue politics, issue specificity, Dom. Okay, so the sensitivity, both the Dow, and so I'm going back and forth as you see between economic, political, cultural, to show that these same kinds of ideas inform thinking in multiple intellectual domains, even though they may not have done that explicitly in the writings as they're concerned, of course. And I'm trying to help you be able to make these kinds of transfers and comparisons. Okay, so the market idea has a strong version of the and that is, and what's the classic concept from Adam Smith that is used to label this. Exactly, the invisible hand. That is the hand of the entrepreneur. If he's a good entrepreneur in a properly efficient, in an efficient market, there will be no hand visible from the entrepreneur, from the manager. It will all be citizens which are driving prices, style, equilibrium points, and so forth. Okay. So the converse, of course, of this is the dynamic leader. So if you have a strong leader daily who says, you know, I'm doing it this way because I'm daily and my father did it that way, let me immediately stop and say, that is, the press may often say that, critics may often say that. What have the more close careful studies of the daily family shown? I mentioned this. Were the daily 1 and 2 similar in their policies in City Hall? Correct. Just elaborate briefly.
Wasn't weren't they like completely different? Like, wasn't RJ Daly was like very much the like organized labor, Chicago machine politics, working with various organized interest groups, whether they organized labor or various ethnic groups to maintain power and more or less like unity within the city, whereas RJ Daly was like pretty sure you almost called like a bohemian mayor, and that he was really all in on Chicago as a scenescape, Millennium Park, he participated in the like biking thing you talked about. I'm sorry, the name is escaping me, but like participating in the event that you said in other people against.
The Gay Rights Parade. He's the first mayor to participate in to march in the Gay Rights Parade. Completely shocking with the press and many Chicago citizens at the time, especially the white Catholics who were seen as basically the positively, that is, what's the evidence for them doing the same thing? They wore the same dark blue suits. They had the same kind of hairstyle. They both spoke Chicago public school English. Okay, so they're and so the
look the same, it's about all.
sorry.
Just looking the same is about all.
Chicago Magazine regularly would criticize both dailies because they couldn't write or speak proper English. And therefore, they must be doing that kind of politics. And so, and the Sun talked more or less like the Spotlight in terms of style, in terms of that style. They both were brilliant, if not Oxford educated. And they were known by mayors who worked with them or saw them over decades when they were in office, from meetings with conference of mayors, from watching them what they did, etc. They both were much more subtle and sophisticated than many other mayors around the world. And so that's why people would talk explicitly. For instance, there was a BBC commentary there's a 1 hour commentary in Chicago at the time when London was revising its sort of legal structure of what the mayor's responsibility should be. Should London be strong mayor or medium or weak mayor? And so the BBC presentation basically said, let's look at Chicago because it's the classic strong mayor city in the entire world. And would this have some lessons for London? And the implicit story was he gets things done better, more efficiently, but maybe there's less participation or or who participates tends to be more highly specific, but it also tends to be more visible leaders than in, and I contrasted, we contrasted in a couple of places. Toronto, especially with some of the later mayors, had in both cities embraced the arts. Daley too, and the mayor of Toronto about the same time saw really the arts were rising and did a lot more things using the arts. In Chicago, it was top down. It was creation of festivals, lakefront events, Lollapalooza, which were popular, but they weren't created by citizen discussions. And in Toronto, it was the opposite. There were lots of little arts groups in individual neighborhoods, and they said, how can we better work with artists to engage them with civic and political and other leaders in this particular neighborhood to make it more sensitive to artistic concerns? Not in Chicago. Okay, or I would say much less. The big exception being Lincoln Park and Hyde Park, which have had sometimes in the 20th century some so-called reform mayors, but reform mayors were 2, 3, 4 until Harold Washington. Harold Washington was the figure who transformed the mayor's office in the political culture of Chicago, away from Daley One to a style which said, we want honesty, disclosure, accessibility, transparency, so forth, because this is what citizens increasingly want across the whole U.S. and more people from across the U.S., especially younger, more highly educated. They don't just want to be cogs in the old style machine as they were under Daley One. They want to use their cell phones, and that is, they're using their cell phones. They're learning more. They want to participate more visibly, actively. And so Daley too basically publicly embraced this political culture, which came from Harold Washington. Harold Washington himself had not been a reformer in that sense. I mentioned Bill Grimshaw was a sweet speechwriter, campaign manager with his wife Jackie. I started the oral history with Bill. And so looking at where and how the Daley too changed and then how that was related to Harold Washington was a fascinating kind of story because it was a fundamental change in this strong, tough, traditional Democratic Party machine, Union Catholic Church, which you have in other parts of the U.S. as well, especially Northeast. But it moved against all of that. And so nevertheless, there's still each of these political cultures are found in different wards, different neighborhoods today, which make it a great city to study because it's cultural and political. Okay. All right, so I've given you, I've gone over some concepts there. Stossman combines, what are the two big theories which she combines implicitly? She doesn't cite either one. But what's she joined? She joins the Adam Smith market competitive model in her analysis of inequality. But the inequality is not the main focus of Adam Smith. Instead, she draws that from a loosely Marxist tradition of studying globalization and immigration, which is often, which at least elements of that which she cites come from that kind of leftist ideological perspective or some of the dynamics, which she's certainly not a traditional Marxist at all. But she joins these in ways that others had not. And so others are now, in that sense, she's a good example of not just taking a simple market, but adding inequality. But her inequality is defined how? What's she talking about when she says globalization leads to inequality? Is she talking about cities or nations or global?
I don't know what global means.
Global markets are part of it, but what's the unit in which she observed? And so the global dynamics are there, yes, that's an important point. On the other hand, how and where does in terms of the market part, but in terms of the inequality part, is that
From the
specialization of,
of labor and the creation of the informal labor
no, is a quick answer.
market.
Good guess, but wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering, and I'm fairly sure there's a section, but, so for example, in a city where there's a lot of, like high paying jobs, like, I don't know, there's certain industries grow.
Which industries?
The professional services was a big one that was mentioned.
Yes. You're answering, that is, you're telling the story, but you're not making the critical
Right, yeah,
subject points explicit. Can you do that?
yes, I was getting there. So the influx of those, wealthy populations,
Is it wealth that's the driver? She's.
well, I'm saying that, so the influx of the populations there necessitate that, there are going to be a greater demand, there's going to be a greater demand for low paying jobs as well, to provide personal services or, to staff the restaurants, to clean floors or things like that. And so that creates, a large disparity between the people who are driving the economy and people who serve those people.
Okay, no, the answer is perfect in terms of the inequality dynamic which she stresses. What you leave out is why are there high income people and how does that relate to the industries we work in? And that's a critical part of her analysis you haven't mentioned. Can anybody else, Anna or anybody? But go ahead. Or anybody else who now remembers how this works and why?
I believe it's because cities have become global centers, interact with other cities in the world, and a lot of the commerce gets centralized in those areas. And so industries like professional services, was my example that I gave, those are going to be, like, those industries are going to centralize their activities in these cities, and then those are going to serve as like gateways to like the rest of the world. So a lot of the capital is going to be flowing through those industries in those cities that are centralized.
Okay, you get 75%, but you don't have the 25% of what's the driver. Why do incomes go up? And that's the global part of her argument from Smith, which you're not mentioning. I'm asking a simple, it should be a simple question, especially if you have any economic background.
So wait, are you just asking like how globalization created like the exponential increase?
Yes.
Like wages?
Yes. And how can you tell that by what data might you look at to try to document this process, not just theorize it? She does this. And there's an MA we discussed in class, which was done critiquing implicitly and testing the ideas of Socrates by a math student here. Okay. Yeah. It's better to be wrong than just to sit silent.
Well, it's kind of a broad point about like the high paying jobs increasing and like the low paying jobs like following that. Did you talk about the global, like how like these global cities kind of dominated these like high paying industries like banking and like the globalization of money, whereas and then the other cities that were not as well off as these global cities that she mentioned, like
have like a higher percentage of like low skilled labor workers, like kind of following like the current trend right now. Well, it's been a trend for a long time, like wealthy countries pushing higher paying industries and like look like poorer countries doing all the
You're using wealth as an explanation, which the press does all the time.
But wealth begets wealth, so how?
That's for you. That is, the question is, how much does fathers or parents' income determine children's income? How strong is that relationship? That's classic practical strategy. Is the US, for instance, more open and free and more, and is there higher mobility in the US than in Europe, for instance? I'm throwing this out as sort of carrots or things to, that is, these are stereotypes which many people talk about, but some of which are either wrong or incomplete. We're trying to get the core element of Sossen's theory, which none of you have talked about. And you're almost there. I mean, what Anna said, you talked about the professions. Is that the term that she used? What did the student use in testing her idea? Wasn't professionals. Concept is producer services. What are producer services? It's not, Sossin didn't invent this. This is in the census, economists, census people use this for, yeah.
So my understanding is that producer services are, services provided by firms that are meant to serve typical consumers, everyday people, individuals, but they're meant to serve other firms, that produce services for the
And they're served, so there are things like big accounting and big law firms. But why does big, as I've introduced it, make a difference? We heard before it's higher income. Does income drive one law firm compared to another? That is, are all law firms better off in New York? And if so, why or why not? And she's asking and she's answering that, and none of you have gotten her main point here.
I think one piece of it, and I know that there's more to it, but one piece is that it's helpful for these firms to be, so producer services firms to be close to other, to like the industries for which they're providing services.
Yes,
And
yeah,
being centralized in one location is beneficial for those businesses.
yes, yeah, I mean, she does say that, that's a good point. That's not the main point that I'm saying. That is, why are some law firms paying more to their lawyers and making more money than other law firms? Some banks compared to other banks. The answer comes from Adam Smith. And that this is her drawing on Adam Smith, not on Marx. She's not saying the 1% is passing on their money and they're always the same 1%. What's the largest firm in the New York Stock Exchange and in the US now? It's in New York Stock, it's really in NASDAQ. What's the largest corporation in terms of dollars in the US today? Apple Computer. Was it based on the father of Steve Jobs passing on the money to his son? No. He was fired from Apple. He worked with other little firms, and he built it up.
I'm so curious. I don't think we can really get it.
Okay, so the concept, the simple concept, and it's an obvious simple concept from Adam Smith, and his term is, which you learned in Economics 101, is called the extent of the market. And the idea, the other term for it is globalization. That is, if one law firm works with New York taxi companies and works with local people on local issues, they will not benefit from globalization. if they're dealing with local market issues. And if Wall Street becomes more international and more global, that law firm should not change its salaries. However, if you have a law firm which has offices and has experts, lawyers, even in Manhattan, or people they can communicate to, and in 1 minute, you say, here's the answer. You've got, say, 400 lawyers, you've got people who know Singapore, who know South Africa, who know Poland, and we say, if we do it this way at Apple, will we have problems with local laws in those countries? Okay, that's what a globally sensitive producer services firm, and that's why they increase more and get paid more, because they get higher fees. Because if you call up a New York law firm and says, and you ask them a question like, how much are say this, if you ask a local New York firm, how is Uber being treated in London or South Africa or Beijing? The New York law firm would say, I don't know, I only know about Uber in New York. That's the point. So it's not the fact that people are high income. It's not the fact that they're professionals in a law firm. Why do some professionals compare to other professions, or some producer services more than other producers? The answer is the extent of the market. And that's the core idea of the whole book about it. The bigger the market, the wealthier everybody gets. It's the opposite of the idea that the rich will stay rich and the poor will stay poor. Everybody will get richer, including the rich and the poor. And that's the core argument of the paper by a London paper that I mentioned, why Sossin is wrong. And his point is, she focuses on New York, where Sossin is more right, let's say. But his answer is London has more welfare state benefits than does the US. And so if you're unemployed or you're low in income, there are more things which protect you against unemployment. You get more benefits. You get fired. You get paid more, so etc. And so everybody, so we have less inequality emerging in London, even though they also have many global patterns. So part of London has been, and so England among the European countries still has more inequality than many. So Germany has a much more explicitly strong socialist tradition, or stronger still, of course, is Eastern Europe. So with the communist background, you get a strong kind of moralistic, political, and specific legal and tax rates and so forth. There's a lot more egalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and so people from East Germany versus West Germany fight over this. And when you go to London, Brexit and all of this, all these things become very visible. Okay, so, but you don't, so laying them out as we have done here, how much does high income generate more high income in the future? That's not, it can be a moral normative question. It should not be too strong, but the question is, can it be made totally equal? So the philosophers have dealt with this, and they say, if we want to really deal with this inside China or inside any strong welfare state, how can we make equal access or equal equality spread further among all citizens? And the simple answer basically is abolish the family. You can't let families raise their own children, because they'll pass on attitudes, values, conscientiousness, a whole bunch of other stuff. So if logically you really want to make people equal, you've got to have schools and daycare and all that kind of stuff raise the children so much that the impact of their parents is dead. Okay, so that this has been actively debated. And so it's an extreme case, and nobody's doing it, but it points to the alternative conceptual perspectives which follow from using a particular normative ideal, such as egalitarianism or competition or improving wealth. Okay. Let's see. Yes, in the back.
Can I just start that?
Sure. Good. Could you maybe just introduce yourself briefly, name and what high school you went to?
I'm Nell, I'm at the Wilberding.
So where
The Wilberding High School in San Francisco.
in San Francisco? But what did you say that you mentioned a name or a type?
The school.
Yeah. Tell us, just give us 3 sentences about your high school.
I went to the Wilberding High School, it's a small school in San Francisco. Yeah,
Public or private?
private.
Private. Okay. Tell us a little bit, just a little bit more.
It had an emphasis on, tech and jobs.
Okay. Interesting. Sorry, I interrupted this. We're trying to get to know each other a little bit, but question you were raising.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the argument about.
The argument of what?
That you were just talking about SASM.
I'm missing the word.
The argument you were just talking about, from Saskia to SASM.
Saskia Sasa, that's what you said. Okay, that's the word I missed.
Basically the argument was that as, firms are able to localize and extend their market, that allows for, them to get wealthier. And so in places with model of welfare, this leads to inequality, rising inequality because some firms are able to localize more than others.
Because of what?
Because some firms are able to extend their market more effectively.
Yes. So are you asking a question or sort of restating the discussion?
I just wanted to clarify, and the other argument is that this doesn't apply in places like London because there's no welfare and that basically neutralizes that disparity, right?
Yeah, or let's say weakens.
Okay.
To neutralize, you've got to abolish the family. Okay, move in that direction. Yes, okay, so that is an excellent restatement of the two competing factors which she's put together: markets and inequality. And because many of their dynamics are both complicated and not joined as well as she did, she deserves a gold star. Okay, so that's why she's famous. Okay. Yes.
In terms of the midterm review, I went over the study guide that was posted, and I was wondering, you can say no, but I was wondering if it would be possible that to have a list of terms. Because I was I made one myself, with my notes, well, but just going over just the Saxon argument, I realized that I missed important words, I misprioritized the keywords, and I don't want to do that for the midterm. So would that be possible at all? To
Sure.
go over
No, that is
the list
what-
of keywords?
absolutely. That is, what we suggested there, Juan really put this together, is that look at the first 2 pages of the syllabus and look at the commentaries by me and look for keywords. Okay, so maybe you took them from there or from your own reading or whatever, but are there any keywords on your list which we have not talked about or which you're ambivalent about their meaning and would be useful to discuss now? Put it that, and anybody else?
Well, it's not so much individual words or concepts that I would want to go over. It's more so I put this together today and yesterday and read the syllabus, like the first.
That's great, that's great.
They did the syllabus, but I still like am missed a couple, but I'm just wondering if it would be possible at all, if we could get like a key list, just so I don't miss any points.
If you,
For instance, like-
if you've gone through the syllabus, you've done it. So that is, I'm trying to say, be a little more active. You can see what, if you can't see the keywords in 2 pages, you don't deserve to be here. That is, you know they're key. You may not, you may not know what they mean, so you may have mixed up income with the extent of the market. To start on,
Oh, I was just saying, I know we also only have to do 4 out of 8.
we also what?
On the exam, I believe we'll be given 8 and we choose.
Yeah, I didn't say exactly 8. I said some proportion. That's
Oh, that's what the review, doesn't.
okay, but that, I guess then I would say, don't take it so exact as literal as that. Antoine was a very, these guys are permissive and listen, so for Antoine, you gotta do this. That was his style, and that's in the memo. So I tried to edit it out and send stuff back to Tim. I'm not sure how much it changed, but don't take things as too literal. But we gotta, if there's something, if he said 8, we gotta change that instead of feeling totally constrained.
But I assume that we would.
There'll be choice. I mean, you're yeah.
We don't have to about half. of-
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not necessarily half, but there will be choice. That is, there will be some things which you may either don't know and don't want to answer, but, or put differently, even if you get something wrong, if you answer it thoughtfully and creatively, you show that you're thinking about it and using these kinds of concepts, that's fine. You can still get an A exam.
But for some reason, during the week, if you feel so inclined to make a list of words, I will gladly. If the wind blows in a certain direction, see, we have a lot of fun.
Okay. Yes.
If we do not lose those viewpoints on the midterm, are we able to switch formats? I know that there are different like configurations of, oh, you can do just the final paper or the final and the final paper, the midterm final paper with regards to your final grade. If we aren't satisfied with how we do the midterm, are we able to like just be like, all right, I'm not going to count that in my final grade and just take a grade of some at the final paper, we'll go with the final decision and final paper.
Yes, I've discussed this in class twice at least. And the quick point is, the more you participate in taking exams and doing postings on Canvas, and especially if you do a full 20-page paper, that can be much more important than the midterm exam. So if you're ambivalent about doing any kind of paper, do a paper. Or that is, if you really do a bad job on the midterm, write an A paper, and you get an A in the course. That's a very simple way of answering your question.
So you're taking like a holistic approach.
Yes. But we're taking an approach which will say you can only improve your grade if you do more. That is, we're not going to say you got a B+ on one, a B- on the other. We're only going to split the difference. That is, we're saying if you do more of these things, you do more postings, and then we've asked you as well at the end of the course, send us one Word document with everything that you posted in one place, so that the TAs and I can go over all of your participation and see what you've done, even if it's been in different places. So, yes. Anything else on specifics like that? Anybody have a concept that is here? Florida. How about the gays in Florida? We had the Colbert on television, in the Colbert report session, he showed Florida. It's only about 1 minute. Said, I'm going to destroy you, Florida. And he did. And but Florida did not say, yes, I was wrong. He talked as if Colbert just didn't understand. And what was the example? Gays.
Oh,
What did Florida say about gays?
like, physical bear say something like, oh, try to like move, try to follow like this gay couple and then move where they move. That makes this point. And then tolerance creates economic.
Did you have a subject in your sentence? What creates tolerance? Yes, I mean, that's the big point, which I would say Florida is right on. But he specifically was talking about gays. And so I'm not disagreeing, because that is lots and lots of evidence that tolerance can increase other kinds of innovations. But he specifically, and this is what was controversial, but wild and innovative when we all first read the books. Wow, look at this. The more gays in a city, the more you have more high-tech jobs growing. Okay? And Florida basically said the same thing on the TV program. 20 years later, when he'd been refuted, but he didn't admit it. So he really was talking on the program, only very briefly, but as if gays really were a measure of tolerance, and that this was the driver that really made a difference. Or when he came to Seoul, when we were in Seoul with the mayor, and as we knew, everybody knows, Korea, China, Japan have been super successful in their economies. And so we said, are gays visible and active in Seoul? We don't want those gays here. Florida says they don't get it. And he went out on an airplane and went back to the US. I stayed and I said, talk to us more. What's wrong with our theory from the West? But you're booming here with the economy. So there must be something wrong with it. So that's what the book called Kentucky Karaoke, and how by changing some aspects of how these theories work, context shifts it, then you can get what seems to be the opposite result. And the simple statistical answer was, we include education as well as percent gays, and we take Florida's data, Florida and Gates's data, the answer is the driver is education. Education really is what's leading to more high-tech jobs, not the percentage. That's a simple statistical fallacy called seriousness. Missed, and because they really didn't analyze the data carefully. Yeah.
Just a question, like about your opinion of Florida as someone who has like interacted and worked with them in the sector. I can't help but think that he did it for the shock factor.
Yeah, I can't help but think what?
That he made the statement about like the LGBT community and economic growth for like the shock factor, especially in like an academic realm 20 years ago. And despite like being disproven and despite having like different statistical correlations being more powerful than his, like his stubbornness with it, like is it and like his like all like the publicity things that he did for this going on TV, and like what do you think about this? I don't think I can't give you that much credit. I live in West Hollywood right now. It's very predominantly gay neighborhood, and just like this would not fly there. Like and
So what would not fly? in the,
like just like almost seeing like using the gay community as a shock factor in publishing it.
you're saying gay, because gay in a gay neighborhood, it's not a shock factor? Or you're saying
No,
yes?
I think that I am a little uncomfortable that it just doesn't seem as scholarly as he makes it to be. So I was wondering, not like away from this class, like just your personal opinion of like him, his decision as a scholar and like a personality.
No, the highly sensitive, politically incorrect question. I'll give you a highly sensitive and politically incorrect answer. Which is that I knew him before he did the book, when he was still doing sort of boring journal articles. And we shared data together, we worked together, and I saw he was very smart and creative and was doing good, challenging new things. And I've continued to work with him because of that. On the other hand, I'm practically the only that I know, serious academic who says this. Almost all the academics just hate Florida, and they say, yeah, it's this, it's that. So, but mostly, if you take even some big names that are on the reading list, they're jealous because he's tweeting every day like Donald Trump. If you look on Donald, Richard Farr is tweeting today and saying this. He's no longer doing as much original research as he used to. He's getting, at the beginning of his website, which is to take a look at his website, at the top of his website, he's got Converse shoes, he's got the companies that he's consulting with and advertising that. I mean, how many academics would ever do that? I mean, if they did it quietly, they wouldn't advertise it at the top of their personal list. Okay, so he's doing these things which flaunt all the classic, somewhat leftist, anti-business kind of feeling that you have among many academics, even in economics and whatever. And combined with the fact that he has really done some things which are really academically very irresponsible, such as not recognizing the Mexican. But he does learn and he changes what he's doing. So for instance, he dropped his index called Bohemianism when I pointed out, you're not measuring Bohemianism, these are just simple census measures of artists. All artists are not Bohemian. You need measures directly of tolerance and Bohemianism if you want response. Okay, so I can go on, but is that enough? But is he the only academic who may get disproven and doesn't admit it? Everybody else saying I was wrong in paper one and I'm not going to be right in paper two. Okay, just another example that I mentioned in class. Harvey Mollich, in contrast to his co-author, John. I won't go too far. Harvey Mollich and John Logan written a bestseller book called Urban Fortunes. It's at the end of the reading list, and I introduced it earlier, to say that it talks about the city as a business machine. It's a paper by Mollich, and then Mollich really changed his views and wrote about Ventura versus Santa Barbara, and looked at this. That in turn stimulated a big debate in the American Sociological Review, etc. But my point is, he's an example of a highly respected among many academics who don't say I was wrong, but they change the views. His co-author, John Logan, did the opposite. Logan said, we were wrong in the book, Urban Fortunes. And business is not that dominant. And business may take this kind of perspective that business leaders may, some business leaders may see this, but we were wrong in the ways that we did in the book. And then he cites two, and then he does a review of the literature. It was called 20 years after the book was published. One was a review of the case studies of individual business leaders. The other was statistical analysis. Any other questions? Do either of our TAs here want to ask a question which might help us or comment?
Really just echoing what the professor said about making sure you know what's in those first 2 pages of the syllabus is really core because those are the readings. Following what the professor identified as more core readings with the asterisks, especially those are kind of, especially what he's talked about, more so what you're drawing from. But it really doesn't hurt. Really helps to read all of it. And be able to draw on those insights from other authors, even if you're talking about another author. Build those connections, extra points.
Yeah, I would just say like there are a couple of the key concepts that today we have already reviewed, we have gone through this thing, terms of those key concepts and how like how a question can be framed out of that and like this because they are like those key concepts will be like very important for you. 4 weeks, we have a couple of key concepts. We have gone through them today, and so today was very important class. We went over like a lot of key concepts like from week 1, invisible leadership, dynamic leadership, and from moving that to cultural relativism and stuff like that. So those are like a couple of key concepts. So, yeah, just keep in mind and you'll be all over.
Something that it's available on the Canvas site is a paper, part of a book from Hubert Blaylock and then Arthur Stinchcomb, and I think the filing is Blaylock, whatever. But it shows you about drawing path diagrams. When I've done that, I'm illustrating the idea of try to be able to restate a complicated, messy argument clearly and specifically to say with boxes and arrows. And I did that for Sasson, showing the first line was globalization led to inequality. Then we had 4 other ways of diagramming how it might work, including one which said the opposite of Sasson by a neoclassical economist who said, you know, more competition, more globalization ought to increase wealth of everyone, not just increase inequality as in New York City. And the answer and how can we resolve those 2? I'll leave as a question for you to think about or being able to answer. Okay. Cheers. Or look at the session where we discussed it and the answers are all there.
In the long run, markets work, but in the long run, we're all dead. I remember writing that down.
John Maynard King. Okay. Good questions. Thanks for showing.